Stevie Wonder's hands froze above the piano keys. The entire studio went silent. Jimmy Fallon's face changed in an instant, tears streaming down his cheeks, his hand covering his mouth. No one in the audience moved. The cameras kept rolling, but something had shifted. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't rehearsed. Something real, something raw, something no one expected was unfolding live on The Tonight Show. And it all started with a sound that cut through the music like a knife through silence. The Tonight Show, starring Jimmy Fallon, Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, had seen thousands of performances. Legends had graced that stage. Icons had sat in that guest chair. But what happened on this particular Thursday night would become something different. Something that transcended entertainment and became a moment of pure, unfiltered humanity. It was supposed to be a celebration. Stevie Wonder, one of the greatest musicians of all time, was scheduled for a special performance. The producers had planned everything down to the second: the song selection, the lighting cues, the camera angles. Jimmy had done his usual pre-show prep, reviewing notes, rehearsing his introduction, making sure every detail was perfect. The audience filed in that evening with the usual excitement that comes with seeing a live taping of The Tonight Show. Tourists from Ohio, a family from Brazil, college students from NYU, all cramming into those iconic studio seats, phones tucked away, ready to be part of television history. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would change how they saw late-night television forever. Backstage, Stevie Wonder sat in his dressing room, his fingers moving across a Braille music sheet. At 73 years old, he had performed on every major stage in the world. He'd won 25 Grammy Awards. He'd written songs that defined generations. But tonight felt different to him. He couldn't explain why, but there was something in the air, something he could sense in the way only Stevie Wonder could sense things. Jimmy stopped mid-joke during his monologue. The entire studio froze. Because in that moment, he heard it too. The show opened as it always did. Jimmy's energetic entrance, the signature desk slam, the monologue hitting all the right beats. The audience laughed at the political jokes, groaned at the puns, applauded at the pop culture references. Everything was going according to plan. The Roots provided the musical punctuation. Questlove's drums, the horns, the perfect late-night rhythm that had become synonymous with the show. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, Stevie Wonder!" The audience erupted. People stood. Cameras swung into position. Stevie was guided to the piano, a beautiful Steinway grand that had been specially positioned center stage. Jimmy stood to the side, visibly honored, his hands clasped together in that way he does when he's genuinely moved by a guest. Stevie settled onto the bench. His fingers found the keys with the unconscious precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in conversation with music. He was going to perform "Isn't She Lovely?", a song he'd written for his daughter Aisha when she was born. A song about pure, unconditional love. A song that had made millions of people smile for nearly 5 decades. The opening notes rang out. That signature harmonica melody that everyone recognizes within 2 seconds. The audience started swaying. Questlove nodded his head in time. Jimmy closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. It was perfect. It was magical. It was exactly what everyone expected from a Stevie Wonder performance. But then, 47 seconds into the song, something happened. Subscribe now and leave a comment, because what happens next is something no one in that studio, or anyone watching at home, could have possibly predicted. Stevie's hands lifted off the keys mid-chord. The music stopped. Not a natural ending, not a planned pause, but a sudden, jarring stop that sent a ripple of confusion through the studio. The Roots kept playing for exactly 2 more beats before they realized something was wrong and fell silent. Jimmy's smile faded. He took a step forward, concern flashing across his face. The audience murmured, uncertain. Was this part of the performance? Had something gone wrong with the equipment? Stevie sat completely still, his head tilted to the left, his entire body oriented towards something only he could perceive. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the sudden silence. "Wait. Do you hear that? The studio went from confused to utterly silent. Every person in that room, nearly 200 people, held their breath. Camera operators stopped moving. Producers in the control room leaned closer to their monitors. Jimmy stood frozen, his eyes locked on Stevie. "There's someone here," Stevie said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone's skin prickle. "Someone who needs to be heard." What happened next would be replayed millions of times, analyzed frame by frame, and debated across every social media platform in existence. But in that moment, it was raw and unrehearsed, and completely real. Stevie turned his head toward the audience, his sightless eyes somehow seeming to see more than anyone else in the room. "In the third row," he said. "On the right side. There's a woman. And she's carrying something heavy. Something she's been carrying for a very long time." The cameras frantically tried to find who he was talking about. The audience members looked at each other, confused and electrified. And then one woman, an older woman in her late 60s, wearing a simple blue cardigan, slowly raised her hand. "It's you, isn't it?" Stevie said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. The woman nodded, then realized he couldn't see her nod. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He walked off his mark, left his position, and did something no late-night host had done in the middle of a live taping. Jimmy didn't hesitate. He stepped away from the stage, walked directly into the audience, past the first row, the second row, and stopped at the third row. The cameras scrambled to follow him. Producers were frantically whispering into headsets. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't approved. This could derail the entire show. But Jimmy didn't care. He knelt down beside the woman's seat, his expensive suit touching the studio floor, and he looked at her with complete attention. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Margaret," she said, her voice shaking. "Margaret Holloway." "Margaret," Jimmy repeated, making sure everyone in the studio could hear. "Stevie says you're carrying something. Do you want to tell us what it is?" For a moment, Margaret just sat there, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The entire studio waited. Millions watching at home waited. And then, slowly, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn cassette tape. "This was my son's," she said, her voice breaking. "David. He died 3 years ago. Car accident. He was 28. The studio was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming. "David loved Stevie Wonder," Margaret continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "When he was born premature, only 3 pounds, we didn't know if he'd make it. I stayed in the NICU with him for 2 months. And every single night, I would play Isn't She Lovely on this tape player we smuggled in. I changed the words in my head. Isn't he lovely? Isn't he wonderful? The nurses said they'd never seen a baby respond to music like David did. His heart rate would stabilize. His breathing would even out. That song saved him." Jimmy's eyes were glistening. He reached out and gently touched Margaret's hand. "I haven't been able to listen to it since he died," Margaret said, tears now flowing freely. "I came here tonight because I thought maybe, if I heard Stevie play it live, I could remember David the way he was. Happy. Alive. Dancing in our kitchen. But when the music started, I couldn't breathe. All I could think about was that hospital room and how I failed to protect him and—" "You didn't fail." Stevie's voice cut through the air. He had stood up from the piano and was now facing their direction, his hand on the piano for orientation. "Margaret, you gave your son the gift of music. You gave him life twice. Once when you brought him into this world, and again every night you played that song for him. That's not failure. That's love in its purest form." The audience was crying. The band members were crying. The camera operators were crying. And Jimmy Fallon, who had made millions of people laugh for years, who had interviewed presidents and pop stars and everyone in between, sat there on the studio floor with tears streaming down his face. "Can I have that?" Stevie asked, gesturing toward the cassette tape. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Jimmy took the tape from her trembling hands and walked it up to the stage, placing it carefully in Stevie's outstretched palm. Stevie held the tape close to his chest for a moment, as if listening to something within it. Then he did something no one expected. He walked over to a producer standing in the wings and asked for a cassette player. "We don't have one," the producer whispered. "Those haven't been used in years." "Check the prop department," Stevie said firmly. "There's one there." "I know there is." 3 minutes later, a 3-minute break that felt like an eternity, a production assistant came running onto the stage with a dusty cassette player that had been found in a storage closet. Stevie took it, inserted Margaret's tape, and pressed play. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. The sound that came out of that cassette player was warped, stretched, barely recognizable after years of sitting unused. But it was. "Isn't she lovely?" Stevie's own voice from 1976, tinny and distorted through ancient magnetic tape and cheap speakers, but unmistakably his. And then, underneath the music, another sound. A baby's gurgle. A tiny laugh. David's first sounds, recorded accidentally in that NICU room 28 years ago, preserved on magnetic tape, forgotten until this very moment. Stevie's face transformed. "That's him," he whispered. "That's David." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had never noticed it before. All those years of playing the tape, she had never heard her son's voice hidden in the background of the song that saved him. Stevie sat back down at the piano. He positioned the cassette player on top of the grand piano, speakers facing out. And then he began to play along with the tape. His 2024 fingers dancing in harmony with his 1976 voice, creating a duet across time, with a baby's laughter weaving through both. Jimmy stood at the edge of the stage, his hand over his heart, tears running unchecked down his face. He had taken off his tie without realizing it, holding it in his clenched fist, a physical anchor to keep himself present in this moment. The audience rose to their feet. Not in applause but in reverence. Standing witness to something sacred. Stevie played the entire song, never missing a note, even as his own voice cracked with emotion. When he reached the final chord, he held it, letting it ring out, letting it mix with the baby's laughter still playing from the cassette, until both sounds faded into silence together. The studio stayed silent for what felt like an hour but was actually 7 seconds. Then Stevie spoke. "Margaret, your son is still here." In that laughter. In that music. In you. You didn't fail him. You gave him the most important thing any parent can give a child. You showed him that love sounds like. And now, whenever you need to remember him, you don't have to be afraid of this song anymore. Because now you know he's in it. He was always in it. Margaret was sobbing now, but they were different tears. Not the tears of grief she'd carried for 3 years, but the tears of release. Of permission to remember joy instead of loss. Jimmy walked back into the audience. He knelt beside Margaret again, and this time, he did something that would become one of the most iconic images in late-night television history. He took the tie he'd been clutching, his Tonight Show tie, the symbol of his role as host, and he gently placed it in Margaret's hands. "This is for you," he said quietly. "So you remember that tonight your son was here. That Stevie heard him. That we all heard him. And that David's love for music, for life, for you, it's still alive." Margaret held that tie like it was made of gold. Share this video and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Because what happened next changed everything. The producers wanted to cut to commercial. The schedule was already 12 minutes behind. But Jimmy shook his head. He walked back to the stage, stood next to Stevie, and said something that would become Tonight Show legend. "We're not going to commercial. We're not moving on. Because this is why we do this. Not for the jokes. Not for the ratings. For this. For moments when entertainment becomes humanity." He turned to the audience. Everyone in this room has a story. Everyone watching at home has a story. And tonight we were reminded that those stories matter. That grief matters. That love matters. That music matters. And that sometimes, the most important thing a TV show can do is stop being a TV show and start being a space where people can heal. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. The Roots joined in, standing beside their instruments. Questlove walked over and embraced Jimmy. Stevie stood at the piano, his hands resting on the keys, his face tilted toward heaven. That night, Jimmy didn't finish the show with his usual goodbye. He simply said, "Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, David. Thank you, Stevie. And thank you for reminding us what matters." The cassette tape now sits in a small frame in Jimmy's office. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Margaret still has the tie. She plays the tape every morning now, without fear, with only love. And somewhere, in the space between music and memory, a little boy's laughter still echoes, proving that some sounds never truly fade. They just wait for the right moment to be heard again.